I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in someplace unusual.
There are films that entertain. There are films that inspire. And then there are films that become something else entirely. Something that burrows so deep into the human heart that generations later, people still hum the songs without knowing why, still feel the ache of that alpine meadow, still tear up at a man singing quietly to his children while the world around him crumbles. The Sound of Music is that kind of film. But here's what most people never knew, and what a powerful studio spent decades making sure they would never find out. Behind every perfect frame of that beloved 1965 classic was the story of chaos, injury, deception, personal torment, and secrets buried under contract clauses and studio silence. The magic you saw on screen was real, but so was the mess hiding just behind it. And for a very long time, talking about that mess was simply not allowed. This is the story of what really happened on the hills, in the gazebo, on that lake, and in the minds of the people who made one of the greatest films in cinema history while quietly falling apart doing it. Before a single frame was filmed, before Julie Andrews ever set foot in Salzburg, the story of Maria von Trapp had already lived several lives. In the mid-1950s, the tale of an Austrian musical family who defied the Nazi regime and fled their homeland reached European cinemas through a pair of German films. They were modest productions, quiet, sentimental, deeply rooted in post-war longing. West German audiences embraced them. The films became the biggest domestic box office successes the country had seen. The story spread across Europe and even found audiences in South America, touching people who had never met an Austrian and never would. When those films were eventually screened for American studio executives, the response was polite dismissal. Too soft, too foreign, too earnest for Hollywood. Nobody wanted to touch it. But one man did. A stage director named Vincent Donahue, fresh off a Tony Award win, watched the German films and saw something everyone else had missed. Not the low-budget production, not the awkward pacing. He saw the soul underneath, the raw, unpolished truth of a real family's courage. And he said something no one in the room expected. This story should not be a film at all. It should be a Broadway musical. It should be built for Mary Martin. That single sentence set off a chain of events that would eventually produce one of the highest-grossing films of all time. But the road from Donahue's vision to the silver screen was paved with bad deals, personal catastrophes, creative battles, and secrets that studios threatened careers to keep buried. Maria von Trapp herself was not a businesswoman. She was not surrounded by agents or entertainment lawyers. She was a woman of deep faith, practical purpose, and genuine indifference to fame. So when German filmmakers came knocking in the early 1950s asking to purchase the rights to her life story, she agreed. The price was $9,000, a one-time payment, no royalties, no future earnings, no percentage of anything. Even accounting for the value of money in that era, it was a fraction of what her story would eventually generate. And the terms were far broader than she fully understood at the time. She had, in effect, handed over the commercial future of her own autobiography for the price of a modest used car. What made it more complicated was that Maria did not even know how large things were about to become. By the time Broadway came calling, she was in the jungles of Papua New Guinea doing missionary work. No phone, no electricity. No way to reach her beyond handwritten letters that piled up unopened at remote mission posts. When Mary Martin's husband Richard Halliday tracked her down with letters about a Broadway production, Maria literally tore them up. She was not interested. She had more important things to do than worry about her name in lights. It was only when she returned by ship to San Francisco and found Halliday waiting at the pier, pressing tickets to see his wife perform into her hands, that anything changed. Maria attended the show almost as a courtesy. What she witnessed on that stage moved her deeply, and with characteristic simplicity, she gave the venture her blessing with a casual wave of permission that she likely never imagined would one day be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She never saw that money. That detail matters. The woman whose life, faith, courage, and family gave the world one of its most beloved stories died without receiving anything close to what the story earned. When producers first envisioned the Broadway version, the plan was straightforward. used the real Austrian folk songs the Von Trapp family had actually performed in concert, and commissioned perhaps a handful of new numbers to bridge the story. Bring in the legendary songwriting team of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein to write those few additions. Simple enough. Rodgers and Hammerstein had a different view. They declined the partial assignment entirely. Their position was clear. They wrote complete scores, or they wrote nothing. They were not interested in serving as supplementary composers to someone else's folk catalog. It was everything or nothing. The producers paused. They waited while Rodgers and Hammerstein finished another project, and when the duo finally returned to the Von Trapp story, they approached it as a complete work, entirely original, entirely theirs. What emerged from that decision was a collection of songs that would outlive the film, outlive the stage production, and outlive almost everything else created in that era of American popular music. Do-Re-Mi, My Favorite Things, Climb Every Mountain, Edelweiss. These were not adaptations of existing tunes. They were born specifically for this story, and they became immortal. The Broadway production opened in November 1959 at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater with Mary Martin in the lead. The advance ticket sales alone exceeded $232 million, an almost incomprehensible figure for a stage production. The show ran for nearly 4 years, closing in June 1963. By then, a bidding war for the film rights had already begun, and 20th Century Fox had won it for over $1 million, more than $13 million in today's terms. This from a studio already hemorrhaging money after the catastrophic production of Cleopatra. Executives who questioned the purchase were not entirely wrong to be nervous. Julie Andrews had already proven herself one of the finest stage performers of her generation. Her run as Eliza Doolittle in the Broadway production of My Fair Lady was the stuff of theatrical legend. Her voice alone could fill a theater and silence a room. When the time came to adapt that show for the screen, the studio passed over her entirely. The reasoning offered was that she lacked the kind of cinematic presence that film audiences demanded. Audrey Hepburn, elegant and already a proven screen commodity, was cast instead. Most of Hepburn's songs in the final film required vocal dubbing. Andrews was professionally wounded by the rejection. She had given years of her life to that role and been told, in effect, that her face was not right for the camera. Then director Robert Wise was searching for someone to play Maria Von Trapp, and someone at Disney quietly suggested he watch a few minutes of an unfinished film called Mary Poppins. Wise watched. Within minutes, he had made up his mind. He signed Andrews before the film even had a release date. The contract she received was a flat fee of $225,000, no royalties, no percentage of profits, no bonus tied to performance. Fox did not believe she was a big enough name to warrant a back-end deal. When The Sound of Music went on to become the highest-grossing film in history at that point, Andrews received nothing beyond what was originally agreed. The studio that had doubted her watched her carry their most profitable film ever and paid her a fixed sum for the privilege. Mary Poppins, meanwhile, had arrived in theaters and become a sensation. Andrews won the Academy Award for Best Actress. At the ceremony, she thanked Jack Warner, the man who had rejected her for My Fair Lady, by name. The audience understood exactly what she meant. It was gracious, precise, and entirely devastating. Finding an actor to play Captain George Von Trapp proved unexpectedly difficult. The role seemed appealing on paper, a commanding, brooding widower who undergoes a gradual emotional transformation. Robert Wise approached Sean Connery, then at the height of his James Bond fame. He considered Richard Burton. Bing Crosby was discussed. None of them were right, and some simply said no. Christopher Plummer was a different case. He was classically trained, dramatically sophisticated, and completely uninterested in playing a character in a musical he found saccharine and beneath him. He turned the role down multiple times. He referred to the project privately as The Sound of Mucus. He told colleagues the script was relentlessly sentimental and disconnected from anything he found artistically meaningful. Robert Wise flew to London personally to persuade him. Plummer agreed, but only if he could reshape the character. He wanted genuine dramatic depth written into the captain. He wanted real dialogue, real emotional stakes, and a song that would give the character an interior life rather than simply a commanding exterior. The result of that negotiation was Edelweiss, a song that sounds as though it has existed forever, rooted in Austrian tradition. In fact, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it specifically to give Plummer's character a moment of quiet, private vulnerability. It is the only song the legendary duo ever wrote that is commonly mistaken for a folk song. Plummer arrived in Salzburg and found himself miserable. He described the city as beautiful but oppressive, a gilded cage built out of picturesque sentimentality. He drank heavily throughout the production, a fact he would eventually acknowledge, without apology, in his 2008 memoir. During what would become one of the film's most emotionally resonant scenes, the performance of Edelweiss before an audience of Nazi officers, Plummer was, by his own admission, significantly drunk. He said the alcohol helped dissolve the stiffness he otherwise felt in the role. And yet, the performance worked. Completely and devastatingly. The trembling sincerity audiences read in the captain's face during that scene, the barely contained grief, the patriotism wrapped in sorrow, moved millions of viewers. It still does. The man who despised the film managed, through some combination of professional discipline and accidental authenticity, to deliver one of its most powerful moments while barely able to stand straight. There was one more indignity awaiting him. The high notes in the captain's musical numbers were not performed by Plummer at all. A professional singer named Bill Lee, who had also dubbed vocals for Disney productions, handled the extended vocal passages. Plummer's speaking voice was preserved for spoken dialogue and transitional moments, but when the full musical demands arrived, Lee stepped in. Plummer discovered this and was furious. He felt it undermined the integrity of his performance. The producers felt they could not afford the risk. Audiences never noticed the difference. Decades later, in his later years, Plummer softened. He admitted the film had gradually won him over, not immediately, not quickly, but eventually. He acknowledged the joy it had brought to people around the world and allowed himself a measure of quiet pride in having been part of it. It took him a very long time to get there. Of all the secrets the studio worked hardest to suppress, the most human, and the most absurdly funny, involved the film's most romantic scene, the gazebo sequence, in which Maria and the captain finally confess their love under soft moonlight, is considered one of cinema's most tender romantic moments. It was meticulously designed, carefully choreographed, and in the finished film, utterly convincing as a scene of genuine emotional intimacy. What the audience never saw was the 19+ failed attempts it took to get there. The lights used to simulate moonlight for the scene were enormous industrial carbon arc lamps. They were powerful, expensive, and, as the crew discovered, extraordinarily loud. The specific sound they produced was not a hum, or a buzz, or a mechanical whir. It was a sound that, in Julie Andrews' own words, was precisely indistinguishable from a long, resonant, wet raspberry. Every time Plummer leaned toward Andrews to deliver the scene's intimate dialogue, the lights beneath them produced the same sound, repeatedly, without variation. The crew lost control. The actors lost control. Lines that were intended to convey the most delicate emotional surrender, "Maria, I love you," dissolved into helpless laughter the moment the lights announced themselves. Take after take collapsed. Hours passed. The scene refused to happen. Director Robert Wise eventually made a decision born of pure pragmatism. He abandoned the lighting plan entirely. Rather than continue trying to coax a romantic scene from two actors who could not stop laughing, he repositioned them in front of the glowing windows of the gazebo itself and shot the scene largely in silhouette. Their faces were partially obscured. The laughter could not be seen. The scene could finally be completed. What emerged from that desperate improvisation was, accidentally, more beautiful than what had been planned. The glowing, dreamy, slightly ethereal quality of the gazebo scene, the quality that makes it feel almost dreamlike, as though it exists outside ordinary time, was not the product of careful artistic vision. It was damage control. 20th Century Fox understood immediately that this story should never reach the public. Cast and crew received clear instructions. The failed takes, the industrial noises, the laughter, none of it was to be discussed. For decades, audiences watching that scene believed it had been crafted with effortless precision. The truth remained locked away until Julie Andrews, on a television talk show years later, finally told the story herself, laughing as she recalled how difficult it was to maintain any romantic dignity with the large machine producing embarrassing sounds directly beneath her face. The production's dangers were not always comic. During the filming of the boat scene, in which the Vaughn-trapped children tumble into a lake, 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played the youngest child Gretel, nearly drowned. The crew had been informed before the shoot that Carruth could not swim. The plan was simple. When the boat tipped, Julie Andrews would fall toward the child and pull her to safety immediately. It was a controlled sequence with a clear safety protocol. When the boat actually capsized, Andrews fell in the wrong direction, away from Carruth rather than toward her. The child went under, then came up, then went under again. Another cast member jumped into the water and pulled her out. Carruth swallowed enough lake water to become ill afterward and developed a fear of water that remained with her for years. Andrews was deeply shaken. She described it later as one of the most frightening moments of the entire production. Not the kind of fear that dissipates when the camera stops rolling, but the lasting kind that sits with a person. Even the film's most iconic image, the one that appears on posters, in parodies, in cultural consciousness everywhere, came with a physical price. The opening sequence shows Maria twirling through an alpine meadow, arms spread wide, the camera sweeping overhead in a vast circular arc. It looks like pure joy, like weightlessness. To achieve that aerial shot, a helicopter flew approximately 20 feet above Andrews while she held her position in the field. Each pass of the helicopter produced a wall of downward wind that knocked her flat into the grass. She would get up, straighten herself, and prepare for the next pass. Then it would knock her flat again. This happened at least 6 or 7 times before the crew captured the footage they needed. Andrews described the experience in interviews with characteristic good humor, noting that she was repeatedly slammed into a hillside in Austria while trying to project the image of spiritual liberation. The gap between what the audience sees and what the performer experienced could not be wider. That is, in many ways, the defining story of this entire film. 20th Century Fox had every reason to protect the film's image fiercely. They had paid an extraordinary sum for the rights at a moment when the studio was already in financial crisis. The production had gone nearly $2 million over budget due to weather delays in Salzburg, where 1964 turned out to be one of the wettest years in recent memory. What was projected as a 6-week location shoot stretched to 11 weeks. 250 cast and crew members sat in rain-soaked hotels burning through money, while executives back home wondered if this cheerful musical would finish what Cleopatra had started. When the film finally released in 1965, the response was unlike anything the studio had anticipated. Not just commercially successful, historically so. Within 18 months, it had surpassed Gone with the Wind as the highest-grossing film of all time, a title that Picture had held for nearly 3 decades. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Critics who had dismissed it as sentimental fluff were forced to reconsider. The studio's instinct to protect the film's pristine image made sense in that context. Every story of laughter in the gazebo, every child pulled from a lake, every actor stumbling through a scene 3 sheets to the wind, all of it threatened the carefully maintained idea that the sound of music was something elevated, untouchable, perhaps even slightly sacred. But the truth, when it finally came out piece by piece over the following decades, through memoirs, through interviews, through the quiet candor of aging actors who no longer felt bound by old agreements, turned out to make the film more remarkable, not less. The idea that something this beautiful was assembled from equal parts artistry and accident, discipline and chaos, genuine feeling and desperate improvisation, that somehow only deepens the affection people feel for it. The hills were alive, but the people making the film were thoroughly, magnificently, humanly alive too, struggling and laughing and drinking and getting knocked flat by helicopters and pulling children from lakes and trying, against considerable odds, to make something that would last.